Kenya's High Court has suspended some sections of a controversial new security law. 8 clauses were blocked until a legal challenge by the opposition and rights groups is heard. The government deemed the law necessary in fighting the Somali group Al-Shabaab, but critics claimed the law would turn Kenya into a police state. The law was fiercely debated in Parliament 2 weeks ago, and scenes of fighting and aggression made international headlines.
Order now. Order, members. Let the speaker come.
Joining us to discuss developments in Kenya, Research Director, Advocacy Group CAGE, Asim Qureshi. Asim, thank you very much for joining us. Now, 2 weeks ago, we heard about these controversial laws. Now, some of them have been retracted and amended. This has got to be welcomed, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, when you consider what was being put on the table here, what was put on the table, which was pretty much a year in detention without charge in custody in Kenya as part of counter-terrorism policy, then of course, I mean, this is just far too long a period, especially when you consider Kenya's human rights record. I mean, even now it's 90 days. When people talk about it in terms of days, but when you actually talk about it in terms of months, it's 90 days is 3 months in detention without charge. It was mooted here in the UK, and it was stopped by Parliament. But when you think about it in terms of the impact that it would have on the life of an everyday Kenyan to be held for that period of time, it would destroy the income of the individual, destroy the family, the social structure that the individual is involved in. There's so many implications from having such a long period of detention without charge. But of course, going from 360 days down to 90 is, it's still a big difference.
Now, the scenes we saw in Parliament 2 weeks ago were crazy. We saw parliamentarians fighting with each other over these laws. What exactly did these laws entail?
Well, I think the key provision is this. I mean, obviously, it was a wider counter-terrorism strategy that they were putting forward. Kenya's counter-terrorism policy so far has worked in a way that hasn't had much oversight. There hasn't been a great deal of scrutiny at a parliamentary level. So some people were suggesting that by actually putting some of these proposals through Parliament, that this would at least bring some kind of oversight to the anti-terrorism police unit, who have been famous for being involved in extrajudicial killings, who have been involved in a great deal of renditions and torture and arbitrary detention. So, from some perspectives, you can understand the argument that was being pushed forward, but really all it was doing is putting on a statutory basis in Kenya a lot of the abuses and giving a statutory basis to the abuses that would continue to take place in exactly the way that they were already.
I know you mentioned the extrajudicial killings. We heard of the killing of an imam earlier this week who was held over the weekend, and he's not the first imam to have been killed. Can you tell me a bit more about what's been happening with cases like that?
That's right. I mean, there are people that I knew while I was doing investigations in Kenya. And, when you consider individuals like Abu Bakr Sharif, who was known as Makaburi, and his execution. And, these are people who were obviously critical of the Kenyan government. They presented a view towards groups like Al-Shabaab, which obviously the Kenyan government would disagree with, but weren't necessarily inciting violence against any individual or any group or the government themselves. So, the fact that these people are being summarily executed, really doesn't bode well for the country. And there's been a great deal of these kinds of executions taking place, but because a lot of human rights groups are not permitted to work on the ground over there, and those that are under a great deal of pressure and fear, and it becomes very difficult to actually hold these groups to account.
Will this be a blow to the government's ability to deal with groups like Al-Shabaab?
No, because of the way that they're dealing with them already. I mean, the point is that Kenya already has an extremely counterproductive anti-terrorism policy. So, all this would have done is actually cement a lot of the abuses that are already taking. Kenya actually needs to rethink its strategy in its entirety And that involves actually more transparency, more rights, more due process, rather than the route that they've taken, which is to basically take people's rights away from them completely, to give complete and utter impunity to the anti-terrorism police unit, the ATPU, and to just generally ride roughshod over all norms of justice.
We know that Al-Shabaab have now confirmed the killing of the leader after the Pentagon attack earlier this week. We don't hear a lot about the war on terror in the region, but we know a lot's taking place, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've been doing investigations in the Horn of Africa since 2007, and Kenya played a crucial role in the rendition of men, women, and children. Over 80 people. There were even women that were, literally days away from giving birth, who were put on these rendition flights to these cage prisons in Ethiopia en route through Somalia, where they were interrogated by the FBI, by Mossad, and other security agencies around the world. So Kenya's had its hands dirty for a very, very long time, and it's actually seen in many ways as the partner of choice within the region. I mean, you've already got Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, which is an American-run facility, but in actual fact, it's in many ways Kenya that is leading the way in terms of carrying out basically America's wishes in the region.
And what sort of an impact does it have on the Muslims in the region and in these countries? Because we know there are many, many Muslims, many of these countries in the region, majority Muslim countries. What sort of an impact does it have on these individuals who are then often harassed by the government due to their faith?
I mean, it's caused a great deal of tension. If you think about areas such as Eastleigh in Kenya, where there's a massive Somali population, then tensions are really, really high in places like that, as they are cracked down upon, as people are being picked up arbitrarily, as they're being killed arbitrarily. So the problem is that because Kenya from the very beginning chose to take such a unlawful approach in the way that it dealt with the threat of political violence within its own borders, and the way that it chose to ally itself with America against the Union of Islamic Courts when they were in control in Somalia. The fallout of that has been that they've just continued on the path of unlawfulness, really, in the way that they respond. So, of course, the people that suffer then on the ground are those communities that come under this excessive surveillance by the state and who are being constantly abused by the security apparatus. And of course, what we know from political violence in other parts of the world is that leads to a great deal of disenfranchisement, often resulting in people joining groups that we would want them to do.
Asim, you mentioned there the relationship between Kenya and the US. We know that David Cameron has called Goodluck Jonathan in Nigeria his greatest ally in the region. What sort of an impact do the dealings of these presidents in Africa, Goodluck Jonathan in Nigeria and also in Kenya, have on leaders both here in Britain and then in the US?
Well, I mean, there's close cooperation all the time. I mean, we've heard stories of the way in which UK police and security agencies work very, very closely with the anti-terrorism police unit in Kenya. We've seen reports from individuals who were rendered into CIA custody who ended up being in Guantanamo Bay, where it talks about individuals in London and their networks, information that could only have ever come from the UK security agencies. So, what we're talking about here is very, very close cooperation between all these groups. And this actually speaks to the way in which the war on terror has morphed over the years. So initially, the security agencies would be involved in interrogations themselves. Wherever a British citizen or resident would find themselves detained, you'd find MI5 or MI6, playing a role within those interrogations. But now, rather, what they're doing is that they're outsourcing everything. So they're getting countries in Africa, in the Middle East, in the subcontinent to do all their dirty work for them. So they're not held responsible for the abuses that take place.
Asim, can you very briefly tell me about some of the work that Cage is doing in Africa, as we know that you've now set up a base there also?
Yeah, so we've set up our first offices in South Africa. There's a group of lawyers who work from there who have done a fantastic job of really documenting some of the human rights abuses that are taking place in the region, particularly within the Horn of Africa. I mean, while South Africa is the base, I mean, a large proportion of the abuses that are taking place in the East. And so, you know, what we've got actually now is a team on the ground who are able to investigate these abuses and really help bring them to light. So inshallah, hopefully, we're going to see some really good work coming out of them over the next few years or so, inshallah.
Inshallah, and we hope to follow what's going on. Thank you very much for joining us, Asim. We'll have to leave the discussion there, but before we take a break, let's look at what you've been saying on Twitter. Joanne Stowell tweets, #HarperCollins regrets erasing Israel from Atlas, meaning from the Middle East. Israel hasn't defined its borders, so tough. Whilst David Eats tweets about scientific findings telling us cancer may just be down to bad luck. Bad luck is hardly the reason you want scientists to offer for causes of cancer. Human Rights Watch Director Kenneth Roth tweets about the crisis in Car, saying UN warns Central African Republic's displaced Powell Muslim community is more vulnerable by the day. And finally, our last tweet from Dr. Hassan Dorlan, who says, according to the anti-racism magazine Expo, there have been at least a dozen confirmed attacks on mosques in Sweden in the last year. #NoRacism. After this break, we'll be taking a look at that exactly, mosques in Sweden. So join us then.